it's amazing the amount of diversity in the oceans, and even in like coral reefs, which are not very deep. I mean, the different types of creatures and the way they all interface with each other in an ecosystem and interact with each other and really support each other symbiotically, so to speak. I mean, it's phenomenal, and it's almost infinitely complex.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Podcast, the show where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Trey, and I have with me today ICR's geneticist, Dr. Tomkins. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here, and it's cool to talk about something besides genetics.
Yeah, well, you are a geneticist, so that's what you get. You kind of pigeonholed yourself there, but we'll let you talk about something else just as once.
I have lots of friends that are geologists. Though, so,
that's true. That's true. Okay, well, then let's get to it. Today we're going to talk about the young ocean, or rather how the ocean points to a young Earth. And I think that a lot of people, when they think about the ocean, they kind of think about the creatures in the ocean, but we're actually not going to be talking about any of that. We're going to be talking about the ocean itself as an environment, sediment, etc., all that jazz. So let's start with what we do know. Let's start with the basics. Over 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, and most of that's in the oceans.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
That's your pop quiz for the day. Do you know exactly what percent it is?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, me either. I said over 70. So there you go. I see this question a lot, particularly in our comment section in YouTube. And people are like, well, if the Earth flooded, where did all the water go? That's something that we're going to discuss today. So if you have that question, you stick around. All right. So Uniformitarians believe that the current oceans are over 200 million years old,
right,
which is really, really old. If the Earth is as old as these evolutionists believe, as these evolutionary uniformitarian geologists, etc., then the biblical account cannot only be questioned; it can be pretty much discarded. If the oceans are 200 million years old, and we of course believe that Noah's flood occurred somewhere around 4,500 years ago, those two numbers don't align. But evidence in the ocean supports a young Earth, not some notion of 200 million years. So,
well, you know what's really interesting is that before radiometric dating was utilized on igneous rocks to get these dates in the billions of years, the evolutionists actually believed the Earth was much younger. They still believed it was millions of years old, but based on the oceans, that's where they got their data from. But then all of a sudden, radiometric dating became popular, and then they could get billions of years plugged into their system and make evolution seem even more magical and probable. So what's really interesting is that the data we get from the oceans actually points towards a young Earth. And so that's what's really exciting. And there's multiple angles that we're going to talk about, you know, coming from that perspective.
It is interesting that, you know, I mentioned that they believe that the oceans are over 200 million years old, which is old, but it's not as old as billions of years old. So it's like, they're like, oh, the oceans are still that old, but the Earth, it's older, right? It's kind of like they're just pushing it back further and further.
Right.
Okay. Our first topic, we're going to talk about young seafloor sediments. So go for it.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the best places to start because the seafloor of the oceans is largely what's called the Tejas megasequence, or it's the upper part of the geological column, which would be the Paleogene and Neogene period. So why is the ocean so young? And these sediments in evolutionary thinking are less than 66 million years old. And so why is the ocean, roughly 2/3 of it, this Tejas megasequence, or tertiary is what they used to call it and some geologists still use that term. So there's two reasons why we have this young ocean, these young ocean sediments. The first one is that during the global flood, plate tectonics played a very important part in the flood. And so as the continents were separating during the global flood, which John Baumgartner, a geophysicist at Los Alamos Labs, has documented with a lot of modeling and geophysics, he has shown that plate tectonics moved very rapidly during the flood, in very rapid plate subduction. So as one plate was moving and subducting underneath another one, the oceans were being created, new seafloor was being made, the continents separated. And this, if you want to think in geological terms, this began in what we would call the Triassic, and then it progressed all the way up through the Cretaceous. And then actually John Baumgartner just gave a recent talk at some scientific meeting showing how the plate movement was actually still going on throughout the end of the flood up into the Cenozoic. But during this whole process, new seafloor is being rapidly made as these continents are separating. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we get a lot of the Tejas megasequence. Another source of the Tejas megasequence was at the end of the global flood, as the mountains were raising up and the valleys were sinking, as Psalm 104 says. As these mountains pushed up, all of a sudden that creates this system where water is just pouring rapidly off the continents, and it's carving out canyons like the Grand Canyon. We call this late flood runoff. But it's also taking all these sediments and not only pouring them into various places on the continents, like in these big basins, like the Green River Basin and the Powder River Basin near the Rocky Mountains, but it's also pouring them across the continents, like the Ogallala Formation, which covers multiple states. And then I'm just using North America as an example here, sure. And as it's pouring off, filling these basins, also putting sediments onto the continent, it's also pouring into places like the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico has lots of Tejas megasequence that was from late flood runoff. And on average, it's about 1,000 feet thick. In some places, it's even 2,000 feet thick. And just to give you a scope of the immense amount of sediment that was poured into the Gulf of Mexico, it's 40,000 square miles in size. Mm. And so this is a huge amount of sediment. So we get sediments that are very young from this tertiary period in the geological column. We get them from not only seafloor spreading, but also from runoff during the late period of the flood as waters are pouring off the continents and just dumping sediments not only into basins on the continents and other places, but also offshore.
Right. Okay, and just a clarification, we've talked to Dr. Clary at length about the progressive flood model exactly. that he's worked up. And when you use words, just as a clarification for our viewers and listeners, when you use words like the geologic portions like Cenozoic and stuff like that, we're not referring to the time frame that, uniformitarians right. would ascribe to them. They're just geological markers. And, Dr. Clary and ICR stands by, those were all laid down during the flood.
Exactly. So these are just, units in the flood that were progressively laid down from the beginning of the flood to the very end of the flood, where, water is actually pouring off the continents that are rising up and the mountain ranges that are rising up, and it's creating that effect. But the problem for evolutionists is they don't understand why the seafloors are so young mm-hmm. and why such an immense amount of the seafloor globally is so young. And so it's a big conundrum for them, but with flood geology, it perfectly explains what's going on.
Right. Do they even try to come up with an answer? Or are there any, I guess, their response to they're just we don't know, we're not touching that?
Yeah, actually there aren't a whole lot of answers coming from the evolutionists regarding a lot of these things. They document them, but they don't really have a whole lot of answers for it, not a whole lot of agreement among evolutionists that attempt to provide answers because it is a mystery.
Right.
With the evolutionary model. It doesn't make any sense.
And so, of course, from our creationist point of view, it makes total sense. The flood model, the progressive flood model in particular, really fills the void there.
Oh, exactly. And, one thing to keep in mind, too, is that the flood lasted over a year in length, a little over a year.
Not just 40 days and 40 nights.
Not 40 days and 40 nights like people, will often say.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the oceans, most of the flood waters came from the oceans. So what's really interesting, if we had absolutely no mountains and the surface of the earth, which is a sphere.
Which is a sphere.
Clarify that, I'm not a flat earther. But if it was totally flat, actually the entire earth would be covered in 8,000 feet of ocean water.
That's a lot.
And that's a lot. So people ask, well, where did the flood come from? Well, it came from the oceans. Where did it go? Well, it went back into the oceans.
Especially with the rising and the lowering of the mountains and valleys. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the oceans are amazing. The average depth of the ocean is 2.3 miles, which is incredible.
Yeah.
There's some deep trenches that are over 6.8 miles deep. And so the ocean is an incredibly vast reservoir of water compared to land. 70% of the earth is covered by water, and most of it's in the ocean. So that's where the flood came from. That's where the flood went, and the oceans had a major impact in the overall scheme of how the flood worked.
Okay, that does make sense. And when I think about the oceans now, it's honestly, they say we know more about space oftentimes than we know about our own oceans.
Exactly.
because of how deep and vast it is.
Yeah.
And I guess the pressure. Yeah.
Well, they're constantly discovering new creatures and new phenomena in the oceans because it's so vast, it's so deep, and it really is kind of a new frontier.
Related to that, so we just talked about essentially young seafloor sediments. There's also the aspect of that there aren't enough sediments for an old Earth in the ocean. I imagine that if the Earth was as old as they say it is, everything would be just Earth would be a round ball covered in water because everything would be worn down, right?
Yeah, and so when I talk about those kind of sediments, I'm not talking about flood sediments because you have wind, you have rain, you have waves hitting all the coastlines. And so the earth is eroding, and it's eroding at a rate that scientists have been able to determine. And so these kind of sediments actually form mud on the ocean floor.
Okay.
And so what's really interesting is that scientists have determined that about 22 billion cubic feet of mud comes off the continents into the oceans per year.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of mud. And so when you take that into account, the ocean cannot be 200 million years old, or it would be completely full of mud. In fact, there's places in the ocean where there isn't any new mud whatsoever. And so, the mud comes from the waves hitting the coastline, and the wind erodes soil off the continents, dumps it in the oceans. Sediments come out of rivers and are dumped into the oceans. And so, based on the amount of material that's being put into the oceans that form this layer of mud on top of the flood sediments, there's no way that the oceans could be 200 million years old.
Okay. Have uniformitarians tried to explain this away, come up with some sort of mechanism? Where do they think all the mud has gone? Do they say anything about it?
Yeah, one of their rescue mechanisms that they have is that, based on plate tectonics, the continents are the tectonic plates are still moving a few inches per year, and that is pushing some of this mud into deep ocean trenches. Well, the fact of the matter is that only accounts for about 1 billion cubic feet of mud per year.
I was about to say,
that's just a fraction of 22 billion cubic feet of mud per year, if that actually was the case, and that's never been proved. That's just a rescue.
Just conjecture, yeah.
Yeah, it's conjecture. So,
okay.
Fact of the matter is, even with the rescue device of some of this mud being pushed into deep ocean trenches by plate tectonic activity, it still doesn't work. It only gets them a fraction of that 22 billion.
And so really what we're looking at from the ocean floor, from 2 points of view, we're seeing that really uniformitarian thinking doesn't have they don't have an answer for what we see. But from our young Earth creation flood model, and again, it does it comes back to the flood, which if at one point the entire Earth was covered with floodwaters, it would make sense that the oceans would indicate that, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so, these are just practical ways to measure what's going on in the oceans. This isn't, widely theoretical stuff. I mean, the amount of material that's deposited in the ocean, erosion, and things like that, the fact the ocean floors are very young. I mean, this is just, the way it is.
Yeah.
And, I mean,
very empirical.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very empirical. Exactly. And so another thing kind of related to the whole plate tectonics issue is, so you've got basically one plate subducting underneath another one. And during the flood, that happened very quickly. And so basically you had the plate that would be going underneath another one moving very quickly and emplacing that thick material deep within, beyond the crust, even into the upper part of the mantle, which is below the crust.
Right. Okay.
And so what's really interesting is just a couple of years ago, evolutionists or geologists, actually measured with seismic tomography the amount of heat in these deep plates that were way deep. And in fact, these plates are 60 miles thick.
Wow.
And go up to 900 miles below the surface of the ocean. And they found out that they were very cold in temperature. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because if the Earth is billions of years old, and these plates have been moving at only a couple inches per year over that period of time, they should not be cold. They should be really warm, because once you get into the mantle, that whole area there where it connects or interfaces with the crust is very warm, very hot. In other words, everything should have been equilibrated to the same temperature if these slabs were in fact, millions upon millions of years old. But why are they so cold? Well, because based on the flood model, they were pushed deep into the Earth's crust and into the top part of the mantle only a little over 4,000 years ago. So that's why.
Very quickly, too. Yeah.
Yes, they were emplaced very quickly, only a little over 4,000 years ago. That's why they are so cold, and they never have equilibrated to the hot temperature of the mantle and the crust surrounding them.
Okay. I mean, that definitely makes sense. And I think that's not even...
and that's another piece of empirical, data that just... How do you explain that with deep time? You can't.
You can't. Yeah, it's like the evidence is just is mounting. We do, and because I read all the comments, they're kind of on my mind right now as I think about them, because I'm like, oh, what are people going to say when we say this on the podcast? There's a little look behind the curtain. We know that there are going to be people who we have detractors for sure. And one of the things they say is well, you can't prove that God exists or that the flood happened. And it's well, no, not in the way that would satisfy them. Even if we could, it still wouldn't matter. But there's so much empirical, just numbers evidence that their model also...
where does the data? Yeah, where does the data? We're looking at the same data,
right?
Whether we're a creationist or an evolutionist, we're looking at the same data. So, which model does the data fit? Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, when we look at the natural world, the oceans and the various features in the geological column, it all points to what the Bible describes as a global flood about 4,500 years ago. And so that's where the data lines up. That's the model that it fits best. And it doesn't fit this model of millions of years or billions of years of deep time.
And honestly, when I think about that, it kind of blows my mind that we still there's this aspect of why do you not believe in real science? Because like the numbers that we're putting forth, it's like, this is real science. What's your explanation, right? Yeah. So anyways, we'll get comments about that, and we'll get detractors for what we just said, and just watch this part again. Yeah. All right. Let's take a step back.
Okay.
We're still going to talk about the oceans a little bit, but it's time for our random science question of the day. Okay? Are you ready? All right. This is
I get lots of those.
Yeah, yes. This is more about the creatures. We've been talking about the geology. I know that you're not Dr. Sherwin, but because he loves weird sea creatures. But my question is, why do you think that so many of the sea creatures that we see are so odd, weird shaped, or I would even say like almost alien?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the amount of diversity in the oceans. And even in like coral reefs, which are not very deep. I mean, the different types of creatures and the way they all interface with each other in an ecosystem and interact with each other and really support each other symbiotically, so to speak. I mean, it's phenomenal, and it's almost infinitely complex. And of course, you and I know that comes from an infinite creator whose creativity is infinite.
Yeah.
You know.
And they keep discovering new things.
That's what I think. Every time I see some strange creature that it's maybe in the shallow oceans or in a deep ocean trench, I'm just amazed at the creativity. It boggles the mind. But to think about the design, how do you design a creature that can live in a deep ocean trench, 5,000 feet below the surface of the ocean? The pressures are incredible. Or for that matter, think about these whales that will literally dive down to a mile. How do they handle that increase in pressure to be able to do that, to go after, like a sperm whale going after squid that are 5,000 feet below the surface? How do they handle that pressure change? And then how do they find the squid down there in total darkness? It's the engineering behind these creatures is amazing. Yeah. It points to an infinite creator and who's infinitely creative, infinitely powerful. It's amazing. Yeah. And so every time I see some strange, unusual creature, I immediately think, wow, we serve such a big, infinite God. And we're just finite, humans. Our reasoning is very limited. And so when I look at the things that God has made out there in the oceans or even on the land or wherever, it's just phenomenal. It boggles the mind. Yeah. I can't barely comprehend it, but it definitely points me to the amazing God that we serve.
As you were mentioning that, I was actually just thinking, we are land dwelling creatures, and we often say, we have a common designer. So like a common designer, a masterful engineer would know that those creatures living on land would need certain features, certain traits, right? And so we're like kind of used to them, I guess. We're like, oh, that animal has legs, or or we see animals with tails. We see lots of animals with tails, right? It's okay. That's fine. But then we go into and we see creatures that are living in a place that we cannot live. And, and that designer knew that these creatures would need an entirely different subset of of a breathing mechanism, of a way to get around,
Yeah, I mean, a totally different mechanism for getting oxygen out of the environment into your system because we need oxygen for just basic metabolism.
Yeah.
So we breathe air, and we have these amazing systems for breathing air with our lungs and those kind of systems. And then you have creatures like amphibians that have even different types of systems.
Right.
Where they can actually survive in air or water. And then you have creatures in the ocean where they have gills, and they literally don't have to come up and get air unless it's a cetacea like a whale,
Right.
which are entirely unique creatures in and of themselves. And so it's amazing. It really is. And these are very complex bioengineering challenges to create systems like that can survive in the water, in the air, in deep pressures, deep in the ocean. It's truly amazing.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I live on land and not in the ocean because the ocean's kind of scary to me, I'll be honest. So thank you for humoring me on my random science question. It's something fascinating to think about. I think, like glowing creatures and like weird creatures that look like something out of science fiction half the time.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So we've talked about, the ocean from the perspective of the sediments and the mud in the oceans and how those basically look very young.
Right.
From many different angles. But let's talk about the ocean itself and the salt that's in the ocean. So the ocean is famous for being salty. That's why we call it a marine environment. And so if you've ever been to the beach and you gulp some seawater, it's like, that's really salty.
Definitely have. It's disgusting.
Yes, that's because it's 3.5% sodium chloride or salt.
Which seems like a small amount, technically speaking, but I imagine, on that scale, that's a ton of salt.
It's a lot of salt. Well, you think about it, when you sprinkle a little salt on your food, you're not adding that much to it, and the taste is very strong.
If 3.5% of your food was salt, it would probably taste bad.
Yes, it would taste terrible. Okay. Absolutely, yeah. But the salt concentration in the ocean is also a huge mystery to people that want to believe in deep evolutionary time as well. And so what's really interesting is that a study was done on the ocean's salt, and the study was done by a geophysicist and a geologist who co-authored a paper together. And they actually took every evolutionary assumption concerning how the salt came about in the oceans into account. In fact, they started with a model where there was absolutely zero salt in the ocean. And then they factored in 11 different sources to where salt comes from. So we know that salt in the ocean is actually increasing in concentration. It's not holding steady. Now, evolutionists like to claim this steady state model for the ocean salt. So they claim that the ocean is not only a salt coming into the ocean, but salt's going out of the ocean. And it's maintaining this steady level. Well, that's not true at all because we know the ocean's salt level is slightly increasing year by year. So where does the salt come from? Well, it comes from the same place, where the sediments come from that erode off the continents from wind and rain and water coming out of rivers pouring into the ocean. Because the soil on land has a lot of minerals in it, including a lot of salt. And so that's where we get this progressive increase in salt in the oceans.
Okay.
Well, we can actually look at the amount of salt that's in the ocean, and if we assume an evolutionary model where the oceans were just pure water and then over time built up salt from all these different sources, I'd actually like to read a paragraph from a paper that we published at ICR. So
Please
concerning this study, because it's got more information than I can maintain in my brain.
Understood. So,
using assumptions and parameters that were most favorable to an old Earth evolutionary model, which is what they did to give the evolutionists all the
All the chance in the world.
All the chance in the world, exactly. That's well put. They assumed no initial sodium and a minimum input and maximum output rates. A minimum input and maximum output rates. Inputs were calculated from 11 sources of sodium to seawater, including rivers, river sediments, atmospheric and volcanic dust, glaciers, groundwater, and hydrothermal vents. Outputs included 7 sinks of sodium from the ocean, such as sea spray, cation exchange, pore water, halite deposition, basalt alteration, and albite and zeolite formation. Now, the guys that did this were geologists.
Right.
And one was a regular, structural geologist. The other was a geophysicist. So they knew what they were talking about. And they determined, interestingly enough, that based on giving the evolutionists all the cards, that the modern oceans could be no more than 62 million years old. Well, you think about that. If the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, that's 75 times less, the time. And so we obviously don't believe the oceans are 6, but we gave the evolutionists all the cards in these equations. And it turns out that it totally failed their model.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because people will be like, well, 62 million years is still older than 6,000 years. And it's like, well, it's a lot closer to 6,000 years than it is to 4.6 billion years, right?
Well, we don't assume that stuff evolved.
Oh, for sure.
We assume that the globe, the Earth,
all started the way
the solar system, the universe was all created as one massive interconnected system.
Yes.
And so I actually have an article I wrote where I explain why was the Earth and the universe created in 6 days. It's because it's a system of subsystems. In other words, when you put a washing machine together or you build a car or anything that's complex or a computer, you put it together piece by piece, but you do it in a very short period of time. Because what use is a half-built washing machine or a half-built car?
Right.
It's useless. It won't even work. It won't function. So you have to put everything together very quickly in a short amount of time, which is exactly what God did in the creation week, in the 6 days of creation. And so we don't assume that the ocean started out with no salt.
Right.
Well, why is that? Because the ocean's full of creatures that are entirely adapted to a marine environment.
And they need that, right?
Right. Just thousands of different kinds of creatures, fish and squid and all kinds of very interesting creatures that are adapted to live in a salty environment. So we believe that the oceans were created salty in the beginning. Now, we also believe that the salt level has increased over time because we can see that happening in the oceans now. But we believe that the oceans were actually created salty. In fact, they were probably less salty before the flood because the flood would have really churned up a lot of minerals.
True. Okay.
And salts and put them into the ocean. So the pre-flood oceans were probably less salty than what we see now. Plus now we see salt slightly increasing every year as well. But yeah, we don't believe in this evolutionary assumption that it was just initially just water and then salt.
All pure fresh water.
Right, began to build up over time.
Okay, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, so but nevertheless, giving the evolutionists all the cards in the equations, the oceans could not be more than 62 million years old.
What is their answer to that? Do they have one? Is there a rescue argument there?
Well, the rescue argument is what I just told you, kind of the steady state salt model, which isn't even true.
Right.
So really, all of these things that I'm mentioning that point to a young Earth, when you look at the oceans, whether the water itself or the sediments, really the evolutionists have no good stories to explain any of this stuff.
Okay.
And so it's just kind of avoided, It's one of those things where those phenomena in the natural world where it doesn't fit their model, so they don't really talk about it. And when I was actually researching the paper that I did with Dr. Clary, who is a geologist concerning all the stuff we're talking about, I was looking into the scientific literature, and there really wasn't a whole lot on this topic because it's a conundrum.
Because you can't argue with the empirical data. Right?
Exactly, because this is all very empirical type stuff. How fast does the salt build up in the ocean? Is it really maintaining a steady state level? Why are the sediments so young? Why does the ocean look so young?
Yeah.
Based on all this empirical data.
Well, we have our answer.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yes. So to summarize, the flood occurred 4,500-ish years ago, but there was an ocean before that, right? But we believe that it was less salty.
Exactly, and see that's something that's important for Christians who believe in a creator and Genesis to understand that the flood is just key to so much of what we see in the world today.
Yeah,
the pre-flood world was totally different. From the data that we see in geology, it looks like there was a single megacontinent before the flood, which actually evolutionists call Pangea, because they believe that the Earth at one point was a large single continent with shallow oceans kind of intersecting in parts of it and stuff.
Okay.
But during the flood, that megacontinent split apart. And in addition to that, before the flood, there weren't lots of really tall mountain ranges. With these really intense peaks and so forth. There was high hills and valleys and that sort of thing. But really the mountain ranges that we see, like the Rocky Mountains and the Andes Mountains in South America, are very young sediments. They're largely composed of Tejas megasequence. And as they were pushed up, they formed these very sharp, spectacular peaks that we now see. But the pre-flood world was not like what we see now.
Okay.
And in fact, the oceans did exist then, but they were less salty.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the tops of the mountains are Tejas and the bottoms of the ocean are Tejas. The same mega sequence there.
Well, yeah, that's because at the end of the flood, after the continents separated with this rapid plate tectonics that was going on during the flood, the continents were then pushed up, and especially in these points where the mountain ranges were pushed up radically.
Okay.
And so that's why you have the same, Tejas mega sequence.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, do you have any thoughts? We want our viewers to be well equipped. So I like to ask at the end of each of these podcasts, are there any bad creationist arguments, like ones that we've used in the past, or ones that you've maybe heard from someone about, like, hey, this is why the ocean looks young, or this is why the ocean is the way it is? Are there any bad creationist arguments that you would say, hey, we shouldn't use that, we don't want to say that, that's not true, etc.?
No, not really, because most of these ocean arguments have been long-standing.
Okay.
I would say that creationists have not, until recently, recognized how young the ocean sediments were. Now, I'm not talking about the material that's eroding off the continents now, but the flood sediments that are in the oceans. I don't think that's ever been pointed out before till Dr. Clary, our geologist here at ICR, began mapping, the mega sequences in the geological column. There's 6 major mega sequences in the geological column that the people like in the petroleum industry use, which tend to be more informative than these evolutionary, based units in the column. So So, yeah, I don't think anyone has ever pointed that out before or really considered that from the creationist community.
Okay.
But the matter of salt in the oceans, that's been a long-standing problem for the evolutionists, and one that creationists pointed out kind of early on in the modern creation science movement.
Okay.
So the paper actually that I just talked about and quoted from was actually done in the early 1990s. And nothing about that paper has ever been disproven, even in the secular world. So it's
and for reference, I was born in the early 1990s. So, wow. Okay, so that paper's been around for a while, and it's still just as valid as it was.
Just as good. I've actually talked with people that have a geophysics background, geology background, and they say, yeah, that's good data. It's never been adequately challenged. So
awesome. Solid arguments for young Earth from the ocean.
Right.
Absolutely. Okay. Well then, any closing thoughts that you may have for our listeners and viewers? Any encouragements? Anything like that?
Yeah, I would encourage reading this article, and if you could put a link up.
Yeah, we'll link to it.
That would be great, because it covers a lot more detail than what we've talked about.
Than what we can cover in just a short segment.
Than what our brains can remember.
Right. Of course. Thank you so much for being here. It's really been a blast talking to you. I really do appreciate how well-rounded our scientists are, how a geneticist can come in and talk about, ocean sediment and salt content in the ocean, and that's just crazy. So,
well, what's really cool is that, anyone can look at this data, and you don't have to be a geologist or someone who got his degree studying the oceans, because this is very empirical, basic stuff. And so anyone can read this article that I put together with Dr. Clary, who is a geologist. So I just didn't go on some wild hair on my own here. So anyone can read this and get the information out of it that we talked about, and even more, because the article is more detailed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's basic empirical stuff, really. This isn't wild theoretical physics or anything like that.
And you don't need a degree to understand it, right?
For the most part. I would have a high school education.
High school education. Okay. Be at least a little educated before you read this article. Awesome. Thank you again so much for being here. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. We really appreciate you enjoying this episode of the Creation Podcast. We hope that it's been encouraging to you. And like Dr. Tomkins said, at the very least, the salt in the ocean has been used as an argument for a long while, and it still holds strong. So this isn't just new, necessarily groundbreaking stuff, but it's here to affirm your faith that the oceans are young, the earth is young, it hasn't been around for millions or billions of years. So thank you so much for being here. We encourage you to like, subscribe, share with your friends and family. And if you want to get this podcast a week early, or if you want to get Creation.live 2 weeks early, we encourage you to become a member on YouTube or become a patron on Patreon. There are links in the description below where you can do that. So I'm Trey, and we'll see you next time on the Creation Podcast. We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.